Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to This Week in FCPA, Episode 28, for the week ending November 4th, 2016, the High Anxiety Edition. In this week's topics, Jay and I discuss the New York Times article on the China crackdown on corruption as it impacted GlaxoSmithKline. We explore the SEC probe of Wells Fargo and note that the bank has upped its legal reserve fund. We talk about my blog and podcast series on stakeholder engagement. I talk about the FCPA mock trial and the discount that I've been authorized to offer to my listeners, or the listeners of this podcast. We talk about the Cubs win, and Jay looks at it from the perspective of his longtime homer, Red Sox Nation background. Jay previews his weekend report, and we talk about the potential return of Tony Romo. We also take a deep dive into the remarks of Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell at the George Washington University Law School, highlighting FCPA enforcement in 2016. The episode comes in at just over 30 minutes. This is Tom Fox. Thank you very much for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back with This Week in FCPA for the week ending November 14th, 2016. As always, I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome.
Thank you, Tom. Great to be back again. And thank you, everyone, for tuning in and listening to what has happened over the last FCPA week.
So, Jay, one thing I have been wanting to ask as a well-known and self-avowed homer, what do you think the Cub Nation is feeling this week, having lived through your Red Sox Nation experience up until 2004, I guess?
Great question, Tom. I was just when I was dropping off the girls at school, I had a little bit of the Dan Patrick Show on, and they said that all these Red Sox callers should stop trying to big brother the Cubs fans and let them enjoy the euphoria for themselves. So, I know personally there were lots of relatives who visited those who came before who had never had a Red Sox World Championship in their lifetime. So there were lots of fond reunions, little presents left graveside. So I think the people in Chicago will make this last a whole year long, and I salute them. I salute Theo Epstein and all the members of the past members of the Red Sox who are contributed to this, and I also salute Terry Francona. So it was really bittersweet not to have the Sox in the World Series, but to see that there was going to be either one of two deserving franchises that was going to have a first World Championship. So congratulations to both the Cubs and the Indians.
So, and I have to agree with both. I thought it was obviously a heck of a World Series. It doesn't get much more exciting than that. I feel the pain for the Indians fans because I have personal experience on what it's like to lose a World Series. Nevertheless, great series. And, Harry Carey is up there partying somewhere harder than even normal. So Cubs win. Congratulations to Cubs Nation. And perhaps, but only perhaps, in my lifetime, I will have that same experience with the Houston Astros, but only perhaps.
Did you see there's this Harry Carey Budweiser commercial that they're playing, and he's like out in the bleachers and they're singing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game," and he's got a net, and suddenly it looks like there's a homer that's coming up, and he takes the net and he snags a cold Budweiser.
Yeah, classic. So, Jay, we had a really interesting week in the FCPA, and certainly compliance related as well. And let me just start off with what I thought was just an outstanding piece of reporting in the Wednesday New York Times by David Barboza on anti-corruption crackdown in China, GlaxoSmithKline, and their actions around their bribery scheme, their whistleblower, and their their investigation or lack thereof, and the fine and penalty that they sustained. And a couple of things popped up for me in Barboza's article. As you know, I have written extensively on GSK in China, and I focused on the corruption and the bribery scheme aspects. But what he really took a look at was the company's response to a whistleblower. It's not clear now whether that was an internal or external whistleblower. Nevertheless, a whistleblower who detailed for the company not only what was going on, but how it was going on. And the company's mad scramble to really determine who this whistleblower was, institute retaliation against the whistleblower, and as a response to the whistleblowing and attendant investigation by Chinese government officials, try to engage in bribery of those investigating it. So it was a pretty damning report of or at least allegations of GSK. And the question I have is, if David Barboza was able to obtain this information for the New York Times, how did GSK get a declination from the Department of Justice and only a $20 million fine from the Securities and Exchange Commission? Now, I'm going to answer my own question by positing a question back to you, and perhaps you could take it from there. My question is, did the U.S. government decide that GSK had been punished enough by their nearly $500 million fine in China? And that's certainly, I feel, a legitimate position to take. What I question is, if that was the position of the U.S. government, why wasn't that articulated in either the declination or the Securities and Exchange Commission civil complaint, which was resolved the civil side of the GSK matter?
Yeah, good question. I think, can you frame it one more time? Because I have too many thoughts running in my head right now. Specifically, what do you want me to respond to? Because I have a feeling I'm going to go out on a tangent.
Tangents are good, and certainly schizophrenia is well appreciated in any podcast. So, is it legitimate or is it appropriate for the U.S. government to take into account fines and penalties leveled in other countries for the same or similar action? And if it is, should the U.S. government identify that as a reason or a basis of the severity or non-severity of an enforcement action?
Okay. Thank you for being my Prozac, Tom. I think that if you read the spirit of the article, and I've seen Barboza speak before, he gave a keynote this past summer at the ACFE fraud conference, that his point in that article is that both GSK globally, and I think many people globally, really underestimated the sea change that was happening in China. And I think part of it was that GSK had already paid, I believe, a $3 billion fine to the U.S. government, not on FCPA, but other violations. And
right, off-label marketing.
So I have a feeling that we felt we had already taken our 30 lashes from GSK. There was so much reputational damage that was done to them, so much that really underscores what needs to happen in China. So I think these were all soft benefits that accrued to the DOJ, to the SEC. And furthermore, this, really allows us to kind of step back a little bit from not being the global policemen that we have been in the past, that when we listen to people from the government talk, when we read things, there is an incredible amount of cooperation that is happening globally, that enforcers, that prosecutors are sharing information. And we're going to talk a little bit later about Leslie Caldwell's remarks at George Washington University Law School. But one of the things is the Kleptocracy Act. And we are not only about just trying to fine people for wrongdoing, but we want to have those illicit proceeds go back to the people who were harmed. So I think all of that in my schizophrenic answer says that that was the implicit message behind the low fine to GSK from the U.S. perspective.
we probably should add a disclaimer that no opiate-based Prozac was administered to speakers on this podcast, in spite of how we may sound. Excellent point.
Okay.
So next up, our good friends, not former friends, our current friends at Wells Fargo, I think still are struggling with the fallout from their fraudulent account scandal. First was the SEC had instituted a probe of Wells Fargo from obviously a public company perspective. They have upped their legal reserve fund to $1.7 billion, which even for high-priced lawyers and most particularly, translation services, that's a lot of money. So I think Wells Fargo is in for a long road to hoe. Continued questions about the change and at the top, whether the tone has changed. They are still engaging in cross-selling. Whether stopping the cross-selling program is an appropriate response or it's overreach. They're trying to recalibrate, certainly, and I think they're struggling with how to do that in a very public manner. So lots more legal issues for Wells Fargo to have explored with them. Jay, this week I had a really interesting and fun 3-part series on stakeholder engagement, which was based upon an article from bsr.org, an NGO that helps companies increase and improve their stakeholder engagement. As we were speaking, I was notified by the State Bar of Texas that my Part 3 was awarded a top 10 blog post for this week. And in Part 3, I talked about why I thought the Chief Compliance Officer and the compliance function was uniquely suited to help improve and broaden stakeholder engagement. So I'm going to link to those in the show notes. Also, I had the privilege of having a podcast with Allison Taylor, one of the co-authors of the report, and she went into it in some detail. And we've got a lot of specific information on how you can increase and improve your stakeholder engagement with really a wide variety of stakeholders simply beyond your corporate shareholders. So I hope people will check that out. Also, the first FCPA Mock Trial Institute has given us a really nice benefit for listeners of this podcast. You can get a 50% discount to the first event, which will be held on November 16th and 17th. I'll link to it in the show notes, but you'll need a promo code and then go to the site for registration. But dropping it down from $700 to $350, it's a great value, and I hope people will take advantage of it. So you had mentioned a significant event this week, and it was the speech of Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell, who delivered remarks highlighting FCPA enforcement at George Washington University Law School. Here we are, I guess she made those remarks on November 2. This is really the season where government officials talk about, really wrap up the prior year in FCPA and conference season and in speaking to universities. We've seen this for several years now, so this is probably the start of it. It will also be at ACI, the National FCPA Conference, which will be at the end of November and early December. But she made some really interesting remarks, so why don't I ask you to take it from there, Jay?
Great. Thanks, Tom. So it's a really meaty read. We're going to have show notes both to the official comments that were released by the Department of Justice, and then there's a more succinct article that I posted last night on LinkedIn from Corporate Crime Reporter. And this is my take on it, that there were 3 points that Director Caldwell decided to focus on. And the first one was that, over the past 2.5 years, she and her colleagues at the Department of Justice have been focusing on 3 major areas. The first one is the fight on international corruption. We've spoken about that in depth in the past. We've talked about how international corruption is the root cause of a lot of things that we deal with, from ethics and compliance in FCPA. The second point that she made was that there is an increase in transparency in charging decisions. And that is really evident in the new stepped up pilot program. And number three, that she wants to encourage companies to have greater corporate compliance and cooperation. So this, I think, really fits into something that you speak about quite often, Tom, about how to bake your corporate compliance into your daily business. And in her remarks, she goes and talks about some of the significant settlements this year, the Alstom matter, Vimpelcom, Oxif Capital, which is the first private equity firm to be charged. But what two things that I find significant, and I'm sure you'll have your view on this. One was the kleptocracy program that I mentioned a couple minutes ago. And then I find it really significant that in the conclusion of her remarks, she mentions by position but not name Fui Chen, who is now the expert on codes of conduct and compliance programs. And she said specifically that in the past, the DOJ may not have been best positioned to evaluate compliance programs, or they may have not been best positioned to evaluate specific industry remediation efforts. So not only is Wei Chen been brought on to analyze these programs, but she's helping processors run better investigations. So, this is really chock full of things for us to discuss. But I think if I want to read something into the remarks, by closing on this, by looking at compliance, this is now something that is straight in the crosshairs of DOJ, and it's one of the things that is going to be highly calculated into how charging decisions are made.
I agree with everything you say, and to just re-emphasize your final point, Jay, she said, quote, a consistent theme of the fraud, corruption, money laundering, and sanctions cases we've seen over the years has been a failure of corporate compliance, end quote. So it really re-emphasizes the need for corporate compliance. That's one aspect of or one prong of the pilot program of the four prongs. And later on, as you also noted, she names the position compliance consultant rather than the person. But she said that this person or this position evaluates corporate compliance and remediation programs. The consultant is not simply analyzing assisting the company, assisting the Department of Justice in analyzing compliance programs, but she helps prosecutors improve how they approach investigations, once again, from the compliance program perspective. Jay, I was also interested that, if you recall Lanny Brewer's remarks at the the FCPA blog New York City conference, most of the focus was on his remarks around the pilot program, but he also gave some pretty meaty remarks about the compliance consultant, and he, of course, named her specifically Wei Chen. And he said that some of the key questions he sees her weighing in on from his perspective now as an outside counsel who would advise corporations include who owns your compliance program? Is the chief compliance officer and compliance function only, or has it been pushed to the business unit level? In other words, is it operational? Do you test your compliance program? This is more than simply performing a risk assessment, but do you evolve your program through ongoing monitoring and assessments and then incorporate those into a feedback loop, which allows these results to be placed back into your program on an ongoing basis going forward? Does the CCO and the compliance function have the authority to affect changes necessary? Does the CCO have a direct line of reporting to those at the top? And here I would just note, I had breakfast today with a CCO of a major energy company here in Houston, and he works under the general counsel, and the compliance function is in the general counsel's, the legal department. And that is something that has been questioned and discussed quite a bit, and he said it absolutely works for him, but he emphasized he has a direct reporting line. And he goes to the board. He has quarterly meetings with the audit committee. He can informally visit with the audit committee at any time. So he has that direct line, even though He is in the general counsel's office, in the legal department function, and he said he prefers it that way for other reasons that we could perhaps explore some other time. Nevertheless, the key is, do you have a direct line of reporting access to those at the top? And this chief compliance officer does. And finally, is your compliance program right-sized for your company? Even Lanny Brewer recognizes, and indeed the DOJ recognizes, that not every company needs an Exxon-style compliance program, but to have the right size or to right-size your compliance program, you have to assess your compliance risks, and then you have to manage those risks in a compliance program going forward. And Leslie Caldwell spoke about it in terms of specifically stating, quote, many companies have tailored their compliance programs to make sense for their businesses, risk factors, geographic regions, and their work, end quote. So she there, I think, reemphasizes what Brewer said, that it's not the breadth and scope of the compliance program you put in place, it's the breadth and scope of your compliance program as it's operationalized for your company. And that's why I think obviously paper programs fail, but those that advocate simply having a compliance defense is going to drive compliance, they're missing the mark, because it's doing compliance that gets companies credit and helps keep them out of trouble.
All great points, Tom. One thing that I would what I would like to ask that kind of jumps off from this is that it was also mentioned in the remarks that they try to balance the needs of the companies in terms of, whether or not you are publicly mentioned. In the past, most declinations never really saw the light of day. And the first one in recent memory that I can think about was the Morgan Stanley declination. And I'm wondering now, do we just kind of assume that if you are a global company and you're doing business all around the world, and as you will mention for me, so I'll say myself, and you've translated your code of conduct into every language where you do business.
Shameless plug by Jay Rosen there for
yes,
those who didn't.
First of two. But so now, do we just say that this is a minefield, that operating globally, there are too many moving parts and pieces, and as much as you try, you are going to be either rewarded or charged by how well you do your compliance, and that should you be mentioned in a declination, that's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. So are we able to kind of pivot on how we think on this? Do we think chief compliance officers are now starting to get this kind of buy-in on the board level? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Jay, I guess I would look at it more from the business perspective, which is if you are nuanced and nimble enough to respond to the different risks in different geographic regions, which of course specifically include translating your key corporate policies and procedures into local languages so that the local employees can understand them, even if you have an English first communication policy in your company, you're going to have a much more efficient and better run company. And if you have a better, efficient and better run company, you're going to have a more profitable company. So I guess my first response would be the things that you've articulated that are needed actually make more business sense than anything else, because you're going to, at the end of the day, make more money. The benefit or the side benefit or the other benefit would be that they will also help you to receive a much lesser fine and penalty if you violate the FCPA. But it may be that if you have such a robust policy operationalized to the regional level that you can pick up issues before they become incidents before they become full violations, and remediate and not ever have to get to the point where you have to self-disclose. So I think the things that you articulated about operationalizing your compliance program actually make you a better run company, and that's the reason you do it. But you have this wonderful side benefit in the law, which is that you can receive up to a declination and be celebrated, rightly so. for having such a robust program in place.
Great. Thank you for sharing your feedback and for shameless plug number 2.
In case anyone is coming into this podcast late, we are talking to Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen.
All right. So we've done the clubs. You talked about the mock trial.
Right.
Do you want to talk about Matt Ellis for a sec?
Yes, Matt Ellis, our good friend Matt Ellis, partner in Miller and Chevalier. Matt is releasing finally his first book on doing business in Latin America under the FCPA. He's going to have a book signing the week of the ACI FCPA conference in Washington. I believe it's scheduled for Wednesday, December 1st at the offices of Miller and Chevalier. I certainly plan to attend that and celebrate Matt, a good friend, a great writer. And I think that his resource, I've actually had the opportunity to read a preview copy. It is a wonderful resource for the compliance practitioner in Latin America, for the American company who does business in Latin America, and may soon become really one of the standard texts that we in the compliance community use. And so with that, Jay, what do we have to look forward to, or do you have in store for us in the Jay Rosen Weekend Report?
Earlier this week, Tom and I were working on a secret project that we'll tell you about. And one of the things that I took a look at retrospectively are which ethics and compliance and anti-corruption and FCPA conferences I attended this year. And we spoke about the benefits of large conferences versus small conferences and, PowerPoint Lite versus, interactive discussions. So I'm going to put together something that now is a good time to start planning your conference attendance for 2017. So I'm going to have some links to some of the more worthy conferences that Tom and myself and other FCPA commentators attend, and be willing to have some kind of discussion upon it. And the bottom line is that whichever events you attend or whatever things you do locally in your market, as long as you have an opportunity to kind of connect and benchmark with other professionals, it's a great way to keep current to trends in the market and to be responsive to issues that are out there. My other plug is that a week from the following Wednesday, November 16th, United Language Group and Spark Compliance Consulting, which is Christy Grant Hart's company, are going to be putting on a joint webinar certifying your anti-bribery program with ISO 37001, What's in it for me? As I said, it'll be November 16th, 12 p.m. East Coast time, 5 p.m. in the EU, and a very late 9 a.m. here in California. So we will have the links to register for that in the show notes. And Tom, Dallas versus Cleveland, the return of Tony Romo, yes or no?
Return of the prodigal son. I hope he gets a few reps, but frankly, the Cowboys at 6-1, one of the, if not the top NFC teams, they are on a roll with my main man Dak, and they need to keep with Dak. The other point is, he's broken his back twice, and only takes one, and it's not too many millimeters away from very severe consequences. So, unfortunately, I'm sure he's back. I love him as a QB. I've always loved him, but mobility-wise, he is not what he was, and Dak has taken us to 6-1. But if you're going to get some reps in, you might as well get them in against the Browns. So hopefully, hopefully he'll get a few reps, but he won't. Jerry Jones won't put him back in the start. So, but it's going to be interesting to see.
Well, you also don't want him in harm's way. And, if we look at Brady and Bledsoe back in 2001, Brady actually got hurt in the first round of the playoffs, and they needed Bledsoe to come in and beat Pittsburgh. So, I think to your point, get Tony some reps, but, Disney's very popular in this household with Millie and Michaela. So with Tony Romo, I think he's going to be experiencing the circle of life. And just as he replaced Bledsoe, Dak is going to replace him.
So, maybe that portends Dak being closer to Brady than anything else. So we'll just have to see how that plays out.
All right. This was, we really, we got out there this week, Tom. So as always, it's great speaking with you. Next week, are you on location or where are you going to be?
Next week, I am in Phoenix I'm on the faculty for the SCCE audit and board training. So I'll be doing that, but I'll be back in location in Houston for our next podcast recording.
Great.
All right. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.